Welcome to the WJBM Outdoor Show, brought to you by Midwest Tractor Sales in Jerseyville. We're coming to you from the WJBM studios in Jerseyville, the voice of the Tri-Counties. I'm Aaron Quillan. I operate Monarch Rivers, where the mission is simple: kill big deer. Joining us, we have a local legend. Oh. Yes, sir. Mr. Laef Lorton. Laef, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. I'm just going to jump right into it because it's such a great topic to me. It doesn't matter where. I see this all the time, whether you're, talking to some friends or landowners I'm dealing with. There's an absolute succession planning that has to go on with, hunting real estate, farming real estate assets, and I hear about it all the time. People are trying to figure out how to, at some point this farm ground's going to be mine. Or at some point, I've got to pass this to my children. So thanks for being here, having an expert that, can help kind of navigate through some of this. I really appreciate that. Before I ask you a question, though, I think it's probably important to say that none of this is legal advice, that this is just two guys talking, and, you're an expert, but somebody wants to get into the nitty gritty, see their professional or come see you.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you are, if you're looking for a succession plan, the first thing you should do is contact your attorney, contact your accountant, and sit down. Do not take what we have on maybe some hypotheticals that you give me as to the bank, and you go on Google and you prepare it on your own. Yeah, you need to talk to an attorney. You need to talk to your accountant. And yeah, the conversation we're having today is not legal advice. Go out and get your own attorney. Yeah.
Oh man. Well, so as far as I know, and I'm no, I've got an insurance background in terms of insurance planning, but as far as like the overall succession planning, there's a will. You got to do your will prep.
Fair enough. I think that's the basic. Is you go and you talk to an attorney and you say, hey, I want to leave my estate to, my spouse, my children. How can we do this efficiently and most cost effectively? So yeah, that's kind of the first basic conversation, right?
Yeah. And so I'd imagine there are a lot of different levels to it. I do know one level would be overall, net worth, right? If somebody's got, is it 4 million?
Yeah. I mean, I think if you're in Illinois, you have, real estate, you're domiciled in Illinois. Illinois does have an estate tax. And so that estate tax threshold just for this conversation is 4 million, less, taxable gifts that you may make during your lifetime. But, for this conversation, we're looking at a $4 million threshold. There's a formula that goes into it. And, but for this conversation, yeah, that's what we're looking at, is about a $4 million threshold in terms of your assets and, how we can pass those assets along, minimize potential estate tax liability. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So is the state estate tax essentially kind of the biggest, thing to consider when you're doing succession planning?
Yeah, depending on your net worth. That's why we have that conversation right off the bat. The federal lifetime exclusion threshold is 15 million per individual now. Okay. And, most folks around here aren't hitting that. Some are, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But, that's really what I would want to understand with the client when they first come in.
Okay. All right. So I guess with the threshold being at 4 million, there'd be people that were under 4 million.
Correct.
And we talked about you'd see an attorney, do the will prep, and then that kind of paves the way for the succession of your assets, or, your property or house, whatever it so be, whether it be spouse, kids,
Sure, and there's a lot of different vehicles. It just doesn't have to be a will. It could be a trust. It could be a transfer on death instrument. If you're heavy in investments, retirement accounts, it could be by way of your beneficiary designations. So, that's really what we want to understand. What I want to understand when I first meet with the client is, what are your holdings?
Yep.
Do you understand your assets? How are the assets titled? And then from there, we can develop a plan for the client, and also understanding how they would like those assets to flow, right?
Okay.
How they want them distributed upon their death. Do they want restrictions, things of that nature? So, it's just that conversation that you have to understand really what the goals of the client are. And then we can kind of take them into a direction that would be helpful for them.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. I guess if you're talking some of this prime tillable ground, it seems like something in excess of 400 acres would probably equal that $4 million threshold.
Yep. I mean, if you're talking about prime ground, yeah, you're gonna hit that really quick. Especially if we're looking at the $15,000 to $18,000 an acre. Some of the prime ground is what we're seeing now, right? Yeah. Then rec ground as well. I mean, I think if you said, hey, let's just say husband and wife coming to me, they have 400 acres of tillable ground, 200 acres of what we consider rec ground. And just for the purpose of this conversation, we say, okay, that tillable ground's, worth $10,000 an acre, just to make the math easy. So their tillable ground's worth $4 million. Their rec ground, let's just say for the purpose of this conversation, is worth $5,000 an acre. Okay, now we're at $5 million. Mm-hmm. They have other assets. Maybe it's equipment, maybe it's grain on hand, bank accounts, etc., where they have another $1 million. So that puts them at $6 million.
Yeah.
Okay. And if they walked into me and, kind of, and we really talk about, hey, let's really get an understanding as to the value. We'll look at supporting documents as to valuation of the land. We may ask them to get appraisals to really get an understanding of it. But typically we can have a good understanding of what the ground is worth. Right there's $6 million in assets. Typically when folks come in and say, yeah, we prepared a will when we were in our 20s, our 30s, upon the death of the first spouse, it goes to the surviving spouse. All right. That's, most folks will have that. And I would say, okay, if you're worth $6 million now, and let's hypothetically, upon the death of the surviving spouse, you're worth $6 million, your estate's going to pay the state of Illinois $456,000 in estate tax. And that usually gets the conversation going in terms of, okay, well, how can we do a little estate tax planning? And there's ways to do that. We can set up a trust for husband, a trust for wife. As you can see in this scenario, $5 million of it, it's in land. So we can fund wife's trust with an undivided 1/2 interest of the land. We'll fund husband's trust with an undivided 1/2 interest of the remaining land.
Okay.
And then, depending on what the other assets are, but let's just say we can divide those equally. So then we'll divide that $1 million between and fund the respective trusts, where each trust now has $3 million in assets, right? Mm-hmm. Upon the death, we would structure it in such a way, upon the death of the first spouse to die, that spouse's trust would flow into a family trust with a credit shelter status, where the surviving spouse could not encroach upon the principal of that trust, but would receive the income from that trust for the surviving spouse's lifetime. All right.
Okay.
And then that family trust would not be included in the surviving spouse's estate. So theoretically, if the surviving spouse dies with less than $4 million in value, you saved your family $456,000.
Which is still a pretty nifty percentage of,
Sure.
6 million. Okay. So that's basically a strategy using trusts to kind of lower the overall value, and which is a land heavy, I guess, portfolio, right? Or
And we could utilize
assets.
a will with a testamentary family trust. There's a lot of ways to do it, but that's how you would segregate those assets so that it's not included in the first spouse to die. Half of the assets are not included in the surviving spouse's gross estate.
Okay. So a trust essentially is this structure that's viewed by, I guess, what is a trust? What are the basics of a trust?
So the primary concept of a revocable living trust is to revocable. You can amend it during your lifetime.
Yeah.
Okay. So you can make changes to the trust that allow for life-changing situations, maybe circumstances with the family change, maybe circumstances with the value of the assets in the trust change. But the purpose of a revocable trust is twofold. It helps avoid probate. All right. That's number one. And number two is upon the death of the surviving, or upon the death of the trustee, right, then that trust typically becomes irrevocable and it can't be changed. So those terms are locked in.
Okay,
all right.
I get it.
And then at that time, we would apply for a tax ID number, and it essentially becomes an entity, right?
Okay.
That in most trusts, revocable living trusts, are going to be distributed upon the death of the trustor, or distributed into a family trust that's going to be held until a certain event, i.e. the death of the surviving spouse. And then upon the death of the surviving spouse, the family trust is distributed and the surviving spouse's trust is distributed.
So upon death, it becomes irrevocable, but transfers into a family trust.
On the death of the first spouse to die.
Yes. Okay. And then it transfers into a family trust, which is irrevocable.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, a trust is an entity per like U.S. tax code or state tax code.
Yeah, so the trust is going to be considered an entity after the death of the first spouse to die. Prior to that, during your lifetime, okay, that trust is going to be reported under your Social Security number. Okay.
Yeah.
So, not to get into the weeds on this, I don't think we need to get in the weeds on it, but you can do whatever you want in a revocable living trust during your lifetime. You can terminate it. You can transfer assets out. You can transfer assets in without real tax consequences. But upon your death, it becomes irrevocable. All right. And the terms of the trust then control how the assets flow. Okay.
Yeah.
And so what happens in that situation from a succession planning standpoint, let's use this hypothetical of $4 million in tillable acres and then, $1 million in rec. Let's just say they have two kids. Child A helps dad, farm the tillable ground. They may be renting other ground as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
And child B lives a couple states away. When hunting season is in play, that child, their children, all the kids utilize that 200 acres. Maybe they bring friends and they really enjoy that recreational ground. And, maybe mom and dad come in and say, listen, what we really want is we want child A to be able to continue to farm this ground, right? And we want both children to be able to utilize the rec ground, okay? And we want to treat them fairly and equitably, right? So, there's a lot of different ways we can set that up, and it may be establishing an LLC where the trust holds interest in the LLC, that then the LLC owns title to the real estate, okay?
Interesting.
And then within that LLC, there may be restrictions as to transfer of the LLC interest. We may keep it lineal, so no interest in the LLC can be transferred without the consent of all members. Okay. So both child A and child B have to agree. And then if child A wants to leave or wants to transfer interest, can only transfer it to his descendants or child B's descendants or child B or descendants of mom and dad. Okay. So it keeps the children's spouses out of it, and it really keeps it within that family line if that's something that they desire. Okay. That doesn't mean it has to go on forever.
Okay.
But it means that one child can't force the sale of the property.
Right.
And that's kind of the point of that. Now you could structure that within the trust as well. It's just easier to gift units of an LLC or transfer units of an LLC. So take, for instance, if a trust owns title to real estate, right?
Right.
In order to transfer an interest in that real estate, they'd have to record a deed. And you'll see this in old title records where folks were gifting 1% or 2% of a land to their children, right? And that becomes expensive. It becomes cumbersome, especially from a title perspective. So it's easier to just have the LLC hold title and then transfer ownership certificates of the LLC between the family members.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's an entity. The LLC is an entity. It has a separate tax ID number.
Right.
And, but, that LLC has transfer restrictions, buy-sell restrictions, things of that nature as to what is a valid transfer of an LLC interest. So, you can get real creative with that tool.
Yeah.
All right?
Yeah. We're going to take a quick break. We'll hear a word from our sponsors and be right back.
Perfect.
Welcome back to the WJBM Outdoor Show, brought to you by Midwest Tractor Sales in Jerseyville. We're coming to you from the WJBM studios in Jerseyville, the voice of the Tri-Counties. I'm Aaron Quillan. I operate Monarch Rivers, where the mission is simple: kill big deer. And for those of you just joining, we have a special guest, Mr. Laef Lorton. And we were just talking about succession planning of ground and farms. We kind of talked about trust being an entity or almost a vehicle to transfer assets, and then even use of an LLC to kind of help protect those assets, but also kind of creates a more easily divisible, pass through for just passing on shares of the LLC rather than, continuously planning the estate down and down and down and down. So I thought that was really interesting, man. When we're talking about this kind of 600 acre hypothetical, 400 tillable, 200 rec, family uses for hunting, has guests, the whole deal. But active farmers, one thing that I wonder is when the division happens of, how if Johnny's been working on the farm and, his brother, might have taken a career 2 states away, how is that kind of factored in what you see? I mean, it always comes down to the owners of the assets, but I'm sure parents are kind of similar in thinking, whether they want the farm to continue or how that goes.
Sure. I think it comes down to, mom and dad in that situation. What are their desires? What do they think that's best for the farming child, the non-farming child, how they would want the, let's just concentrate on the 400 acres tillable here. There may be some equipment. There may be, other factors that we take into consideration. But let's say they come in and they talk to me and say, hey, we're kind of struggling with this. We love both of our kids. We really want both of our kids. This may be a scenario to have a 50-50 interest in the farm, but we want to ensure that Johnny, as your example, is able to continue to farm that and it can do it economically, right? So, that's a scenario. So then we would talk about, okay, well, we could grant certain rights to Johnny as a farmer or as, within, whether it's the trust, whether it's the LLC, whatever vehicle we're working with, right? Like, let's talk about maybe some restrictions or covenants that we can employ. And one may be if they're really, insistent upon, the ground being held 50-50 between their two kids, but they want to make sure Johnny's able to farm it. It could be providing that child, Johnny, a right to farm that ground on whether it's a crop share basis or whether it's a cash rent basis. They could establish the cash rent and have an inflation adjustment, or they could say, hey, listen, Johnny's going to rent this ground at $200 an acre, that is up to them on how they want to employ that. But we'll talk about ideas, right? It may be on a crop share basis where, let's just look at this, your 50-50 crop share. Landlord, which is going to be Johnny and Joey, right? The sons, upon the death of mom and dad, own that property together, whether it's in an LLC or whether it's them individually, right? And there could be a restriction on that ground that says, and again, let's use the LLC hypothetical, actually, and they're in the property is held in the LLC. Joey and Johnny each own a 50% interest of that LLC. In that LLC, there is a requirement that the LLC lease that ground to Johnny on a 50-50 crop share basis, where the LLC, is responsible for 50% of the inputs, 50% of the expenses, and Johnny, as the tenant farmer, is responsible for the other 50%, and then they share the crop. Under that scenario, Johnny would be receiving 75% of the crop. And Joe, it would flow through the LLC, and then Joe would receive 25% of the crop. That's a way that they could do it, that it, could work out and make it feasible for Johnny. There's a lot of other ways to do it. One way would be, oftentimes I'll hear the client say, well, we want Johnny to receive that ground, right? And that ground's his, and he can, he worked on the farm for 40 years and he's earned that right to own that ground. That's another scenario. So it comes down to the goals of the client, their desires. Remember, it's their will, it's their desire, it's what they want. They control it. My job is to advise them, give them ideas, and then they will ultimately direct me on how to distribute those assets with advice, right? With restrictions, covenants, whatever. So, that is a way to do it. Absolutely. We see that where folks are like, they've worked 40 years on that farm. That's theirs. We want it distributed to them. But we don't want this to happen or that to happen. And then we got to talk through those scenarios. So, I oftentimes say, you can't have your cake and eat it too, right?
Right.
Like, we're going to go back and forth on this, and we're going to have some tough discussions, right? And as we work through it, sometimes very comfortable with that approach of leaving it to the farming child, or, listen, that was his decision. He wanted to stay here and do this. And Joe, went out and did his, but it's not that we should, leave one out and so we'll talk about other ways. There's other assets in this scenario. We have 200 acres of rec ground that Joey really enjoys. That might be to him, although we're looking at dollars, that might be to him more important, more valuable. So we got to look at also the goals of the clients, and then what would the children consider, right? And so what's important to them. And so it's really a good discussion that you have with the client. You really understand, their children, you understand maybe it's their grandchildren, so there's a lot to take into consideration.
And there's all kinds of, we'll just call it entities that, trust, LLC, that I guess represent different aspects, right? You just mentioned grandchildren. Aren't there like generational skipping trusts? Do they still do those?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So that would even be relevant too.
Yep. There's GSTs that you could employ, generation skipping trusts. Again, we could go on but ultimately is how, and you have this conversation with the client as well. How long do you want to control this from the grave?
Yeah.
Wow. Like there can be certain situations where it just, you can't foresee what's going to happen with your family. And if you keep it restricted within that trust over generations, it can really create some problems. And then also it can be great, right? But, I always tell my client, hey, if I had, a crystal ball and I could tell you what the future is going to be, I could really plan this out for you, right? But we don't, and it's, each generation's different. There's priorities with each generation. It may be the farming on one generation is really important, but it could be the hunting ground that's super important, right?
Right.
So we try to plan with what we know now, and as those circumstances change and the client's still alive, still able to make their own decisions. Mm-hmm. There may be, oftentimes I'm meeting with clients once a year. We're discussing the plan. How's it changed? How have your assets changed? Should we consider restructuring the funding of this trust or, the entities that you created? So it's not like it's a one and done. Mm-hmm. We meet once, you sign your docs, and I'll never see you again. It's, and I'm not just me making these decisions. We're oftentimes when we're looking at these larger, these taxable estates, we're bringing in their accountant. We're talking through scenarios. We're talking about capital gains versus estate tax. And there's just a lot to discuss. And that's why you need the accountant involved. There's, they could be holding their, back in the 80s, a lot of farmers were titling their land in C corps, right? Well, there's a tax consequence to that. So we got to bring in the income tax experts and things of that nature. So if we're wanting to divide that C corp or take land out of it, we really got to understand the tax implications as a result of that. And, that's not me. The income tax implications are not me. That's when we bring the accountant in.
Right.
We talk about it. We talk about the structure and how we can achieve the client's goal.
Okay.
Yep.
So how often do clients go back to, well, I guess, how often do you see it that people that own the farms or the assets go to their kids and say, what would you like to do?
It's funny. I mean, so probably when I started practicing, it was really, there was no conversation with the children. It was kind of the, hey, you'll find out when I die.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's great for the parents in certain circumstances because they don't want to deal with it right now. Right. So they're like, yeah, they'll find out when I die. And then, yeah, I'm dead. They can fight about it. Right. Or, you know, I have that conversation, and I'm seeing more clients kind of open to the conversation and say, hey, listen, let's develop your plan. All right. I'm more than willing to put this together, make sure you understand it, make sure you're comfortable with it. And if you want to bring your children in to kind of go through it and the process, so they understand the process and they understand, you know, how these assets are going to be distributed, I'm more than happy to have that conversation with them, you know. And some folks are like, well, you know what, we'll talk to them. And we do, you know, we'll have post signing meetings where we talk to the family and this is how it's going to flow. Or, hey, we'd like to bring in, you know, the children to be a part of the planning process, which is great if they all get along, right? You know, what makes you feel uncomfortable, and, you know, when I will stray from this, I will, you know, typically, I mean, I'm, you know, if they say, hey, we're going to bring in Johnny under your scenario because he's the farming client and we want his input on this, I'm going to make sure that, you know, there's no influence, you know, and typically I'll say, well, Johnny can stay at home. All right. Yeah. This is your will. This is your trust. Unless you want to bring Joey and Johnny in, and we can get Joey, we can send him a link and we can put him up on that TV and he can be in this room and we can all have this conversation. Right. You know, that's one way. And with technology, it's been awesome, you know? So if we have a client that's out in Pennsylvania or has a child that's out in Pennsylvania and they want that child to participate, we can bring him in, right? Yeah. Via video. His siblings can be there with his parents at the table and it's as if he's in the room. So that's really cool. And that's a really good point. I mean, I think the best succession plans made are a group effort, right? But we got to have everybody in the group. You know, I think if it's just one or two, you know, and there's 4 other kids, that's not a great way to approach it, you know? Yeah. Yeah.
When is the appropriate time to start doing this planning?
Now, like, I mean, 18, you graduate from high school, you're going to go to trade school, you're going to go to work, you're going to go to the university. You, at the very least, need a power of attorney for healthcare, power of attorney for property, and probably a will, right? Okay. And I'm not just saying that because that's how my livelihood, but think about it, you know, my child's in Chicago, she's at school. There's a health issue, right? Doctors aren't going to talk to my wife and I unless one of us are named as an agent under her power of attorney, right? For healthcare, or she signed a HIPAA release, right? Which kids don't think about that, right? Right. Or, child is 21. Those custodial accounts we had before are now no longer custodial accounts, and child needs assets, money transferred out of her, Eber Jones account into her checking account. Now, most of them can do that electronically now, right? But sometimes it's just easier for mom and dad to be able to handle it, and they have the POA for property. They can handle that. So, or think about this, child has an interest in real estate, maybe the family farm. They don't have a will, upon the death of that child, if they don't have a will in Illinois, let's take mom and dad, Johnny and Joey as an example. Johnny and Joey aren't married, all right? Joey passes away, he's 25, he doesn't have a will, he has 40 acres. That 40 acres goes to mom, dad, and Johnny. Okay? To mom and dad and his sibling. So, those, maybe he would want it all to go to his brother, right? And having a will in place is going to allow that to happen. So it's never too early.
Right.
Right? And when you start having kids, you need to get it done, because you're also thinking about, well, my wife and I are going to Mexico for a vacation. The plane goes down. I mean, again, I'm not trying to say, but something happens to mom and dad, right? And who is going to take care of our children when we're gone? Who's going to be the guardian? Who's going to be overseeing their assets that pass to them, right? And, if you don't have that in place, then you have your wife's side of the family wanting to make decisions, your side of the family wanting to make decisions.
Yeah.
But by having that nomination of the guardian, having the flow of those assets go into a children's trust for your children with a trustee overseeing it, it's going to make that process so much better. Because think about your kids. They just lost their parents, and now their grandparents are tussling over who's going to be their guardian, tussling over, and they all have good intentions, don't get me wrong, but wouldn't you as a parent like to be able to spell out that process and how it's going to work,
Yeah, 100%.
I always use this example. I love my dad, right? Name mom and dad as the guardian of the children, right? But something happens to mom. That's going to be a lot on my dad raising my children, They're a great team. I'd be comfortable with mom doing that, but if it's just dad, and that's just something to, keep in mind. And so it's never too early. It isn't, I do this purposely. One of the, oftentimes local organizations will come to us and say, hey, can you give to our, auction our charity auction that we have, the first thing we give is a certificate for a young family will package, right?
Really?
And so then, and it's always funny if we're at the auction, like, well, I didn't think about that, but it gets them thinking, okay, yeah, we need to have this in place.
Yeah.
So, never too early.
Okay. Are there any benchmarks along the way, that kind of pop out? We talked about the $4 million tax threshold, but then we also talked about capital gains. So as you got your will prep, but then you're looking at capital gains and maybe trying to mitigate that. I know you do an annual meeting with a lot of your clients, but somebody that hasn't gotten started or has got that will prep and hasn't really, let's say they did just an online will and they think they're protected, right?
Sure.
And then they start achieving success and hitting different benchmarks and have to look at capital gains or stuff like that. Are there any other benchmarks or instances where, hey, flashing light, it's time to go in and talk to your legal advisor?
Well, I mean, any life event like having children, maybe it's grandchildren, things of that nature. I like that you brought up capital gains, because it's always, when you're doing estate tax planning, you also have to be concerned with the capital gains, because you think about that family trust upon the first spouse to die. The assets in that family trust come from the deceased spouse's trust into the family trust, get a stepped up basis at that time of death. But think about this.
Stepped up
Basis, cost basis. So let's use this as an example. Let's say the cost basis, the tax basis, mom and dad acquired that 200 acres of rec ground. And, it's not that long ago that you were acquiring rec ground for $300 an acre.
Right.
Right? Maybe 30, 40 years ago. Now that rec ground, say, has 5,000 an acre or 7,500 an acre. So what happens is upon dad's death, his undivided 1/2 interest in that. So if dad's the first to die and he dies at 60, right? That in that ground that had a cost basis of $300 an acre gets a stepped up basis, an undivided 1/2 interest of it to the value of today, of the date of death. So let's say it's $5,000 an acre. So if that property is sold, right, on half of it, and you sold it for $5,000 an acre, there would be no capital gains, right? Now, let's take the scenario: dad dies, half of that ground has a stepped up basis to $5,000 an acre. Mom lives another 20 years. Okay. And she dies, and the stepped up basis is $10,000 an acre. Okay. Yeah. There's a disparity in that. So you have to take that into consideration, right? So it's like sometimes premature to do estate tax planning. Let's use this 200 acres, for example, that of rec ground. Say, mom and dad come in and say, hey, we have 200 acres of rec ground. It's worth 5,000 acres. It's $1 million. And then they have other assets that are $1 million, and they both have W-2 jobs. We're like, well, theoretically at one point, you're probably going to be at the $4 million threshold. Right. But doing that now could create some capital gains issues, right? So we may say, let's do some estate planning without the estate tax component. All right. So we're not creating a capital gain issue premature. But again, you got to come back to it. You got to monitor that value. Okay. And so that's a great example.
So rather than a life event, it's almost like when you have big significant increases in property value, which, I remember it being about $1,500 an acre early 2000s, and I'm talking just Calhoun rec, right? And then it was like kind of hovered at 3, and then it jumped up another couple thousand, right? So, each time it kind of makes a jump, maybe settles a little bit. This is our new property value. It's probably not going down. And that might be a call to action to say, hey, how does this affect me from a capital gains perspective?
Yeah. I mean, and we would just look at it, another capital gains question we get a lot is, mom and dad are 80, right? And they're like, we don't want to take care of that rec ground anymore. We just want to give it to the kids, right? Yeah. And the kids are ready to take it, Yeah. But it has a cost basis of $300 an acre. And if you gift it to those kids during your lifetime, you're going to be giving them their cost basis. They're not going to get a stepped up basis at your death. And so think about it. That's a huge tax consequence there. Yeah. If they decide to sell the property, the children, at some point. And oftentimes with rec ground, that may happen. It may get to a point where you have 40 acres that adjoins the right person, and that individual really wants that 40 acres. Well, you could sell that 40 acres and you could acquire more, or you could sell it. And if you get a stepped up basis and the capital gain is $1,000 per acre rather than $4,700 per acre, it makes it easier to swallow. Yeah. So that's another example. Oftentimes folks will come in and be like, we want to gift it now. Well, have you thought about this? And once we have that conversation, we're like, yeah, that's silly for us to do that right now.
Right. I like it. All right. Well, we're going to take another break, hear a word from our sponsors, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the WJBM Outdoor Show, brought to you by Midwest Tractor Sales in Jerseyville. We're coming to you from the WJBM studios in Jerseyville, the voice of the Tri-Counties. I'm Aaron Quillan. I operate Monarch Rivers, where the mission is simple: kill big deer. And our guest today, Laef Lorton. We've talked a lot about succession planning for farm ground, for assets, equipment. Just how do we transition farms to those that we want to continue the farm or enjoy the land when we're gone. And Laef, you've talked a lot about some of the different techniques or entities that are used in succession planning, but what does it actually look like if I were to call and say, "Hey, Laef, I've got a will, but we're starting to get up there in acreage, and we need to do something."
Yeah, I think initially you call the office, you get an appointment, and I think it's important for me to communicate with the client. Hey, listen, this initial meeting is a conversation. I'm trying to understand your assets. I'm trying to understand your goals, and I'm not going to have these documents ready. I think a lot of folks think that they're going to walk in and we're going to have these documents ready for them to sign, and it's going to be a one-stop shop. And it's not, it is not as if you're going online and you're checking the box and you were going to spit something out. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're really talking about your legacy here and your children, and, it is important for us to really understand your wishes, mm-hmm. understand your children, mm-hmm. their personalities, their goals, things of that nature. So that first meeting is really just information gathering. You'll talk to my paralegal. My paralegal will, hey, bring in deeds. If you have financial accounts such as the bank, what's great, a client brings in a financial statement. Most farmers are, they will prepare a financial statement for their lender each year. Mm-hmm. That is a great baseline that we can look at in the initial conversation. Yeah. I will say this: farmers never put an accurate value on their land. It's always 6 years behind. You have flat black 80-acre tract and you have it valued at $8,000. That's not, for estate planning purposes, that's not an accurate value. Right. So, we'll go through that process and just really start to understand their assets, how they're held, how they're titled. And then what I didn't do, and I always think this is probably the most common mistake in estate planning, mm-hmm. is make a follow-up appointment, because you're talking about folks, you're talking about their death, right? You're talking about, this is what, and some people aren't comfortable with that. So they may not come back in for 2 years, And right. So initially when I was kind of the school of thought was, all right, set up the appointment, talk to them, make sure they're comfortable with you. If they want to go forward with this, they're going to call you and they're going to come back. No, they're not. They're not going to go back to anybody, right? They are not going to go back to anybody. So
it's more like good talk.
Yeah. So at the end of the meeting, I'll say, all right, let's get our next appointment set up. Mm-hmm. I'm going to put some drafts together. There's still some questions out there. Mm-hmm. We're going to send you these drafts, and then we're going to review them again. And maybe we'll sign at the next meeting, mm-hmm. or maybe we'll work through these difficult conversations we're having, and we can craft a document after the next meeting, mm-hmm. and sign the docs at the third meeting, fourth meeting, fifth meeting, whatever it is. But we just got to continue to keep it on our calendar, right? The mm-hmm. client's calendar, my calendar. It's great for me. It gives me a deadline to get this done. Right. I probably need to get this out mm-hmm. in 2 or 3 weeks because I'm meeting with them in a month and a half.
Right.
So that's one of the most common mistakes, is not scheduling a follow-up. Yeah.
Okay. So being committed to it is
Yes.
probably something that's cost a lot of people a lot.
Sure. And I think being committed to it and it's time too, right? We're all busy. So if you meet with me and you decide you want to come back in and talk to me 3 years later, well, first of all the information we have is stale.
Right.
We have to then start over, make sure we've got updated, so yeah, it's super important for you to just stay on top of it. Let's get it in place. So once it's in place, then we can have, I won't schedule a meeting after you sign it unless you say, okay, I want to meet with you in a year or 2 years. Okay, let's just put it on my calendar and let's get it on the calendar so we know it's there.
Yeah.
But, that's when it's up to you whether you want to come back in and talk to me about modifications. Maybe we should, take a look at different funding objectives. But yeah.
All right. Well, hey, man.
And I would say this, Aaron, not just the accountant, but like financial advisors. We have some great financial advisors here in town, and we work together a lot, you know. So, they will provide us information so we can make sure that the clients have the correct title, the correct beneficiary designation. And so it's a group effort from all the professionals, and we work in a great community. I love it. I love my clients. I love the professionals we work with. And it's fun to be here. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate you, going through all of this because it's something I've been amongst a lot of conversations where people, they know what they want to do, but they don't exactly know how they're going to do it. And
I'm sorry, I kind of nerd out on this, and I was talkative. And
I love it, man. It's great. It's great. So thanks again. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you,
man.